Farmers. They're the cornerstone of modern America. Without them, society wouldn't be as it is today. One would expect that being so vital, they should be rewarded with high pay and benefits like any other job. And this is true. In contemporary America, farmers are doing quite well, hitting record levels of income in 2022. However, there is a hidden past behind them, a past which is so often forgotten in the history books. A past of hardships, struggle, and the biggest turning point for farmers in the 20th century. We bring you Troubled Farmers, a short story.
I'm ready. To provide some needed information, farmers had already been struggling with crop prices in the 1920s due to the massive decrease in value after World War I ended. Crops were just not needed in such quantities anymore, and with this low demand and high supply, the value fell. However, the worst of it was yet to come. Farmers were usually able to barely get by with the money they made, but once the Depression hit in 1929, everything got a lot worse. Some farmers wouldn't be able to pay their debts, and most filed for bankruptcy. The ones who could keep their farms were buried in expenses and taxes. This, along with the Dust Bowl, created an impossible situation for farmers where no matter what they did, even if they worked as hard as possible, the prices on their products would just drop even more.
Farmers, an underrepresented and largely ignored part of U.S. society through the 1920s to 40s, went through a vast amount of failure and hardships in the Midwest, plaguing their livelihood and forcing them to extreme measures to survive difficult circumstances such as the Dust Bowl, heavy price drops, and unreasonably high taxes. However, conditions improved drastically during World War II, and farmers found success that helped them gain notoriety in U.S. society, eventually becoming a vital addition to the American economy.
The farmer decline began in 1929 when the Depression first sparked. The industry's stability, which was already weak, began to slowly fade, and following the severe drop in product demand, as well as removal of price supports, crops such as corn were worth less than coal. The culprit? A massive surplus of crops due to farmers overproducing when there was little demand at the time. At one point, a bushel of corn was worth only 8 to 10 cents. These impossibly low prices would in turn force farmers to farm more crops to pay for their expenses, which brought a further surplus of crops, which sequentially contributed to further drops in prices.
Farmers had created a feedback loop where they were working against their own interests. These massive drops in prices largely led to their failures. Farmers were just not capable of making enough money to pay their debts, taxes, and living expenses. However, there was another factor. The Dust Bowl in the Midwest. People in the Great Plains plagued by the dust storms so severe that crops failed to grow, livestock died of starvation and thirst, and thousands of families lost their farms and faced severe poverty.
Farmers were in a never-ending obstacle course just to get by, and many eventually fell short and could not keep up with extreme requirements to keep in the farmer game. They were forced to foreclose their lands to banks. Entire families and farming communities were on the streets in search of work and a new home. The sudden influx of refugees from the crisis created a huge migration, called the Dust Bowl migration, where farmers went west in search of a promise of a new life and new work. In response to the industry's shortcomings, the federal government created the Agriculture Adjustment Act. The act encouraged farmers to limit their production of crops to prevent a further drop in prices. In exchange, the government would pay farmers for their unused lands. Despite its success in raising prices, the act's distributed money was paid out principally to landowners, who had legal obligations to compensate the tenant farmers and sharecroppers on their land, but enforcement of these obligations were lax or non-existent.
Although the act helped to raise the economic conditions, overall it didn't specifically benefit nor address the low-income issues of the farmers. It was a temporary solution to fix a huge industrial catastrophe. Instead of attempting to help the farmers begin earning a profit, the government's idea of success was solely to help them survive and for them to earn enough money to support their families, and that's all. Overall, farmers had an unparalleled amount of struggle in the 1930s, where they had little to no help.
The salvation farmers had been hoping for came in the early 40s. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor officially brought the US into the Second World War. The unprovoked attack by the Japanese led to an increase in patriotism within the United States, and soon after, millions of people signed up to join the armed forces. With this influx of troops, there was a higher demand for food supplies for the war. Of these millions of troops, many were farmers. The farming industry found itself in an awkward position. The demand for food was higher than it had ever been before in the last decade. However, there was a substantial decrease in agricultural employment, dropping by 1 million during the war. The farmers that were left to produce food were forced to come up with new ways of farming that were more efficient. Eventually, this labor shortage spurred farmers to accelerate the use of mechanical equipment.
The industry was not ready for the sudden increase in demand. However, with increased use of farming equipment such as tractors, the industry was able to meet the needs of the faraway armies. To add on, with a lot of farmers leaving to fight in the war, the ones left relied on volunteers and new people entering the farming industry. Over time, due to the war effort, continuous supply of new workers and aid from the new machines led to huge success in the industry, taking them out of the dark times in the 30s and the Depression. This huge success during the war led to the growing consolidation of small farms into larger, more commercial concerns, a trend that would continue after the war.
The transformation of small farms into larger production farms led to the industry evolving to a huge portion of the US economy, with it making up to 20% of the workforce during the war and 13% of the US shipments overseas. All the improvements and success during the war continued afterwards due to the baby boom, which is known as one of the biggest population increases in history. This meant one thing to farmers: there needed to be more food to feed the more substantial population. In summary, the farming industry experienced huge successes in the 40s due to the sudden large demand of food from the Second World War, modernization and machination of the industry, and the demand for larger quantities of crops continuing after the war because of the baby boom.
A largely underrepresented and ignored group, farmers went through a lot of hardships in the 30s with the Depression, price drops, and high taxes. But eventually, after a sudden high demand from World War II, it led to its huge success in the 40s, converting them into a cornerstone of the American economy ever since. We need to study and remember these hardships to prevent future industries and companies from going down the same route, and to commemorate the farmer families who lost their homes and livelihood due to the Depression. If we can learn from the mistakes the government and farmers made, we will ensure such catastrophes and depressions never occur again, and allow the current and future American economy to be stronger, help it flourish, and make it successful.